The lecture hall fell silent as Professor Velrix adjusted his optical sensors, preparing to demonstrate what he considered an elementary concept in xenobiology. The Calarian instructor stood tall, his crystalline body refracting the soft blue light of the Academy's illumination panels. Around him, 63 students from 12 different species settled into their seats, eager to absorb knowledge from one of the most respected minds at Sentinel Academy. In the back row, partially obscured by a towering Grethian student, sat Maya Chen. Her small frame and quiet demeanor had allowed her to go relatively unnoticed for the past 3 weeks. She preferred it that way. The other students seemed content to ignore the only human in the xenobiology program, and Maya was perfectly fine with that arrangement. Today, Professor Velrix began, his voice resonating with harmonic overtones that made the universal translator work overtime. We will discuss the fundamental limitations of carbon-based life forms, particularly those originating from what we categorize as standard environment worlds. Maya's fingers paused over her datapad. Something in the professor's tone caught her attention. As you know, Velrix continued, manipulating a holographic display that showed various planetary classifications. The universe has established clear parameters for biological development. Worlds with stable climates, moderate gravity, and predictable environmental conditions produce life forms suited for intellectual pursuits. These beings evolve without the burden of excessive physical adaptation, allowing their neural development to flourish. The Galarian student in the front row raised a tentacle. Professor, what about species from harsher environments? Do they not develop advanced cognition? Velrix's crystalline face somehow managed to convey condescension. An excellent question, Trell. While such species do occasionally achieve spaceflight capability, they remain fundamentally handicapped by their evolutionary baggage. Their bodies waste enormous resources on redundant systems, aggressive immune responses, and frankly obsolete survival mechanisms. These biological inefficiencies leave less energy for higher brain functions. Maya felt her jaw tighten. She kept her eyes on her notes, willing herself to remain invisible. Let me provide a specific example, Velrix said, and Maya's stomach dropped. Humanity, a species that recently joined the Galactic community. Their home world, Earth, falls into what we classify as a Category 7 hostile environment. Excessive gravitational pull, wildly fluctuating temperatures, aggressive microbial life, and a frankly absurd variety of large predators. Nervous laughter rippled through the classroom. Maya's knuckles went white as she gripped her stylus. Humans evolved in constant survival mode, the professor continued, clearly warming to his subject. Their bodies are overbuilt, oversensitive, and overreactive. They possess pain receptors in absurd quantities, redundant organs, and an immune system so aggressive it often attacks their own bodies. Fascinating from an evolutionary standpoint, but ultimately limiting for true academic excellence. A Drexian student spoke up, but Professor, humans have made significant contributions to medical technology and emergency response protocols since joining the community. Compensatory achievements, Velrix dismissed with a wave of his appendage. When your species spends millennia simply trying not to die, you become quite good at treating injuries. This does not indicate intellectual superiority, merely specialization born from necessity. Maya's face burned. She'd heard variations of this speech before, whispered in corridors and implied in academic papers. But hearing it delivered as objective fact in a classroom setting, that stung differently. In fact, Velrix said, pulling up another holographic display, I would argue that humans are physically incapable of the level of academic rigor required for advanced xenobiology. Their high metabolism demands frequent feeding. Their fragile psychological state requires extensive rest periods. Their bodies literally shut down for 8 hours every rotation. Imagine the inefficiency. We call it sleeping, Maya muttered under her breath. Unfortunately for her, the Grithian student in front of her had exceptional hearing. His massive head swiveled around, and suddenly several students were looking in her direction. Professor Velrix's optical sensors focused on the back row. Did someone wish to contribute to the discussion? Maya considered staying silent. She really did. But 3 weeks of condescending looks, dismissive comments, and thinly veiled hostility had been building up like pressure in a sealed container. And her human biology, as the good professor had so eloquently pointed out, was not designed for patient endurance. I said, We call it sleeping, Maya repeated, louder this time. She stood up, her 5'4" frame dwarfed by nearly every other being in the room. And yes, we do it for about 8 hours. Because our brains are doing something your species apparently never developed the need for, processing complex emotional data, consolidating memories, and running evolutionary simulations that have kept us alive on a planet that actively tried to kill us every single day. The lecture hall went dead silent. Velrix's crystalline features shifted into what might have been amusement. "Miss Chen, is it? I was not aware we had a human enrolled in advanced xenobiology. How refreshing. Please enlighten us with your perspective." The sarcasm was thick enough to cut with a plasma torch, but Maya was too far gone to care. "You want my perspective?" She stepped into the aisle, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Fine. Let's talk about biological efficiency. You mentioned our redundant organs. We have 2 kidneys, 2 lungs, and a liver that can regenerate from 25% of its original mass. Know why? Because on Earth, having a backup system isn't paranoia, it's survival, and that redundancy has saved countless lives in situations where your species would simply cease functioning." "Fascinating," Velrix said, his tone suggesting it was anything but. "And I suppose you consider your excessive pain receptors an advantage as well." "Actually, yes," Maya shot back. "Pain is data, immediate, actionable data, that tells us something is wrong before it becomes catastrophic. Your species, what do? Wait until your crystalline matrix starts fracturing before you notice a problem? We feel a muscle strain and adjust immediately. We detect inflammation and take action. We monitor our bodies constantly because we evolved in an environment where ignoring warning signs meant death." A few students shifted uncomfortably. Maya was just getting started. "And let's talk about our immune systems, shall we? You called them aggressive. Know what I call them? Effective. Humans can survive in environments that would kill most species in this room within hours. We adapt to new pathogens, we fight off infections, and yes, sometimes our systems overreact. But I'd rather have an overprotective immune system than die the first time I encounter a novel bacteria." Professor Velrix's glow dimmed slightly. "Your emotional response is quite predictable, Miss Chen. It rather proves my point about humans being controlled by their primitive hindbrain functions." Maya laughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make several students flinch. "Emotional response? Professor, I'm furious right now, absolutely livid. Know what else I am? Completely in control. My elevated heart rate is pumping oxygenated blood to my muscles and brain, preparing me for conflict. My heightened awareness is processing every potential threat in this room. My emotional state is sharpening my cognition, not dulling it. That's what you don't understand about human biology. Our emotions are not separate from our intelligence. They're integrated. They're a feature, not a bug." "Interesting theory," Velrix said coolly. "Perhaps you'd like to demonstrate this supposed integration with an actual academic argument rather than an emotional outburst?" "Gladly," Maya said, pulling up her own datapad and connecting it to the classroom's shared display. "Let's examine survival rates for xenobiology field research teams over the past 20 years. Notice anything interesting?" The holographic data spread across the room. Several students leaned forward. "Teams including at least one human have a 93% survival rate in hostile environments," Maya continued. "Teams without humans? 67%. And before you attribute that to humans being good at emergency medicine, let's look at the data more closely. Humans on these teams identified environmental hazards, an average of 47 minutes before their non-human colleagues. They detected predator presence earlier. They recognized contaminated resources faster. They adapted to unexpected situations more efficiently." She locked eyes with Professor Velrix. "You know why? Because we're not overbuilt. We're appropriately built for a universe that is fundamentally hostile to life. You call Earth a Category 7 hostile environment like it's a bad thing. I call it the most effective training ground in the known galaxy." The silence in the room had changed quality. Students were no longer staring at Maya with curiosity or disdain. They were listening. "You mock our need for sleep," Maya continued, her voice gaining strength. "But during sleep, human brains run predictive simulations. We process every interaction, every experience, every potential threat we've encountered. We wake up with solutions to problems we couldn't solve consciously. We dream up innovations that your perfectly efficient, always conscious minds never imagined because you're too busy being awake to think creatively. Creativity born from biological necessity is hardly something to celebrate, Velrix argued, but his tone had lost some of its confidence. Really? Maya pulled up another dataset. Let's look at patent filings. Since humans joined the galactic community, in 3 years, humans have filed more innovative designs for everything from hull plating to medical scanners than the previous 10 years of galactic research combined. And you want to know the really funny part? She smiled, and there was something predatory in it that made several students lean back. Half of those innovations came from humans who were told they were too primitive, too emotional, too biologically limited to contribute anything meaningful. We took your dismissal, your condescension, your absolute certainty that we were inferior, and we used it as fuel, because that's what Deathworlders do, Professor. We take obstacles and turn them into advantages. Professor Velrix's crystalline structure flickered with irritation. Miss Chen, your passionate defense of your species is noted. However, enthusiasm does not override biological reality. You still have not addressed the fundamental inefficiency of your design. Maya's smile widened. Inefficiency? Let's do a practical demonstration. Everyone in this room, stand up. Confused murmurs filled the space, but students slowly rose from their seats. Professor Velrix remained motionless, his optical sensors fixed on Maya with something approaching weariness. Now, Maya said, her voice taking on a lecturer's cadence, I want everyone to hold their breath, or whatever your species equivalent is. Stop your respiratory process completely. Students complied, some more easily than others. Maya made a show of checking her chronometer. Eularians can manage about 4 minutes before cognitive function declines. Drexians, roughly 6 minutes. Calarians, like our dear professor, can last an impressive 12 minutes by slowing their crystalline resonance. Very efficient biology, all of you. She paused, looking around the room. Humans? We can train ourselves to hold our breath for over 20 minutes. Freedivers on Earth regularly exceed 10 minutes. Our bodies have override systems for our override systems. We can force our biology to do things it's screaming at us not to do. We can function through pain that would incapacitate most species. We can push past exhaustion, ignore hunger, suppress fear, and keep going when every logical system is telling us to stop. A Pelian student raised a claw tentatively. But is that not simply self-destructive behavior? It would be, Maya agreed, if we couldn't also heal from it. Human bodies don't just survive damage. We adapt to it. Break a bone? It heals stronger than before. Tear a muscle? It rebuilds with more capacity. Expose us to a toxin? We develop resistance. Our biology literally learns from trauma and becomes more resilient. You call that overbuilt. I call that anti-fragile. Professor Velrix's glow pulsed with what might have been grudging interest. You make valid points about adaptability, Miss Chen. However, you cannot argue that human emotional volatility is somehow an advantage. Your species starts conflicts over perceived insults, makes irrational decisions based on feelings, and allows personal attachments to cloud judgment. Maya's expression softened slightly, but her voice remained firm. You're right. Humans do all of those things. We also form bonds so strong we'll die for each other. We create art that moves people across species barriers. We feel empathy so deeply we'll risk everything to help complete strangers. You see emotions as a weakness. We see them as the foundation of everything worth protecting. She walked down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the quiet hall. 3 months ago, a human freighter crew encountered a Drexian colony ship that had suffered catastrophic systems failure. The colony ship had 2,000 passengers, mostly children. The human captain had enough life support to save maybe 300 people. Know what she did? Several students shook their heads. She dumped her entire cargo, ripped out non-essential systems, and pushed her ship's life support to 140% capacity. She saved all 2,000 Drexians. Her ship barely made it to the nearest station. Her crew suffered oxygen deprivation. Several needed medical treatment, and she lost her entire profit margin for that quarter. Maya stopped in front of Professor Velrix. When Galactic authorities asked her why she risked her ship and crew, you know what she said? She said she looked at those children and couldn't imagine doing anything else. That's human emotional volatility. That's our irrational decision-making. And you know what? I'd rather have that than all the efficient, logical, perfectly rational biology in the galaxy. The professor was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his harmonic tones carried a different quality, an emotionally compelling anecdote, Miss Chen. But science requires more than inspiring stories. You want science? Maya's eyes glinted. Fine. Let's talk about human cognitive flexibility. Our brains consume 20% of our total energy, even though they're only 2% of our body mass. Inefficient, right? Wrong. That energy expenditure buys us something unique. Neuroplasticity at a level unmatched by any other known species. She pulled up more data on the shared display. Humans can learn new languages, new skills, new entire paradigms of thinking at any age. Most species hit cognitive rigidity around your equivalent of 30 years old. Humans? We're still forming new neural pathways in our 80s. We can completely rewire our thinking, unlearn ingrained behaviors, and adapt our entire worldview based on new information. That simply sounds like cognitive instability, Velrix argued, or unlimited potential. Maya countered, Professor, you've been teaching the same curriculum for 15 years. I checked. Your lecture notes haven't significantly changed since you started. Know why? Because you reached optimal efficiency and stayed there. Very logical. She gestured around the room. In 15 years, humans have gone from barely understanding quantum mechanics to revolutionizing fold space calculations. We've gone from basic chemical medicine to regenerative therapies that work on 7 different species. We've gone from planet-bound to establishing colonies in 3-star systems. Not because we're more intelligent than you, but because we're never satisfied with good enough. Our biology won't let us be. A Calarian student near the front spoke up, her voice hesitant. Miss Chen, are you suggesting that human limitations are actually advantages in disguise? No, Maya said firmly. I'm not sugarcoating anything. Human biology is difficult. We're fragile compared to many species. We need frequent maintenance. We're susceptible to countless diseases. We're prone to self-destructive behaviors. We're absolutely a mess. She smiled again, softer this time. But we're a magnificent mess. Every limitation pushed us to innovate. Every vulnerability taught us compassion. Every failure gave us resilience. Earth tried to kill us with predators, so we learned to think tactically. It tried to poison us with plants, so we learned chemistry. It tried to freeze us, burn us, drown us, starve us. And every single time, we adapted. Maya turned back to Professor Velrix. You asked if I thought humans were capable of the academic rigor required for advanced xenobiology. I'm here, aren't I? I scored in the top 5% on the entrance exams. I've maintained a perfect grade point average despite being the only human in a program designed around physiologies. Nothing like mine. I've had to translate concepts through a universal translator that barely handles human idiom. I've had to work twice as hard as everyone else just to keep up. Her voice dropped to something quiet and dangerous. And I'm still here, still learning, still pushing, because that's what humans do. We don't quit just because something is hard. We don't accept limitations just because they're biological. We look at impossible odds and we laugh, because we've been beating impossible odds since we climbed down from the trees and decided to hunt animals 10 times our size with pointed sticks. The lecture hall was completely silent. Even Professor Velrix seemed at a loss for words. Maya gathered her things, slipping her datapad into her bag. You wanted to lecture about the fundamental limitations of carbon-based life forms from standard environment worlds. Here's what you should have said. Species from gentle worlds develop gentle solutions. They're perfectly adapted for a universe that's already safe. But humans? We're adapted for a universe that's trying to kill us. And in a galaxy that's more hostile than any of you want to admit, that makes us the most prepared species out here. She headed toward the exit, then paused at the door. Oh, and Professor, you mentioned that humans waste enormous resources on aggressive immune responses. Last week, the entire Calarian quarter of the station went into quarantine because of a bacterial outbreak. Know who didn't get sick? The 3 humans living in that sector. Our overreactive, wasteful immune systems handled a pathogen your species had never encountered before. We didn't even notice we'd been exposed. Maya looked back at the class, at the dozens of faces from a dozen different worlds, all staring at her with new expressions. Respect? Maybe. Or at least reconsideration. Class dismissed, she said, with a grin that was pure human audacity, and walked out. Behind her, Professor Velrix stood motionless for several seconds. Then, surprising everyone, including himself, he began to produce the Calarian equivalent of laughter. It sounded like wind chimes in a storm. "Remarkable," he said quietly. "Absolutely remarkable. Perhaps I have been teaching the same curriculum for too long." He turned to face his students, most of whom were still processing what they just witnessed. "Let this be your lesson for today," Velrix said. "Never assume that different means inferior, and never, ever underestimate a species that learned to thrive on a death world. Miss Chen has just demonstrated something I've been teaching incorrectly for years. Biological diversity is not a weakness to overcome. It's the galaxy's greatest strength." Outside the lecture hall, Maya leaned against the corridor wall, her heart still racing from the adrenaline surge. Her hands shook slightly. The confrontation had taken more out of her than she wanted to admit, but she was smiling. Because tomorrow, she'd be back in that classroom. And the day after that. And every day after. For as long as it took to prove that a Deathworlder girl who sat quietly in class could change the entire galaxy's understanding of what it meant to be human.